Let's read.
Youngsters. Their names were Will, Jill, Hester, Chester, Peter, Polly, Tim, Tom, Mary, Larry, and little Clorinda. It was summer, and the trees along the way were full of birdsong. We had got as far as Iowa when my dear wife Melissa made a startling discovery. We had 12 children along, one too many. She had just counted them again. I slammed on the brakes and raised a cloud of dust. Will, Jill, Hester, Chester, Peter, Polly, Tim, Tom, Mary, Larry, and little Clorinda, I shouted. Line up! The youngsters tumbled out of the car. I counted noses, and there were 12. I counted again. 12! It was a baffler, as all the faces were familiar. Once more I made the count, but this time I caught Larry slipping around behind. He was having his nose counted twice, and the mystery was solved. The scamp! Didn't we laugh, though, and stretch our legs in the bargain? Just then, a thin, long-legged man came ambling down the road. He was so scrawny, I do believe he could have hidden behind a flagpole, ears and all. He wore a tall, stiff collar, a diamond stick pin in his tie, and a black hat. "Lost, neighbor?" he asked, spitting out the pips of a green apple he was eating. "Not a bit," said I. "We're heading west, sir. We gave up our farm. It was half rocks and the other half tree stumps. Folks tell us there's land out west, and the sun shines in the winter." The stranger pursed his lips. "You can't beat Iowa for farmland," he said. "Maybe so," I nodded, "but I'm short of funds. Unless they're giving farms away in Iowa, we'll keep a-going." The man scratched his chin. "See here, I've got more land than I can plow. You look like nice folks. I'd like to have you for neighbors. I'll let you have 80 acres cheap. Not a stone or a tree stump anywhere on the place. Make me an offer." "Thank you kindly, sir," I smiled, "but I'm afraid you would laugh at me if I offered you everything in my leather purse." "How much is that?" $10 exactly." "Sold," he said. Well, I almost choked with surprise. I thought he must be joking, but quick as a flea, he was scratching out a deed on the back of an old envelope. Hector Jones is my name, neighbor," he said. "You can call me Heck. Everyone does." Was there ever a more kindly and generous man? He signed the deed with a flourish, and I gladly opened the clasp of my purse. 3 milky white moths flew out. They had been gnawing on the $10 bill all the way from Connecticut, but enough remained to buy the farm, and not a stone or tree stump on it. Mr. Heck Jones jumped on the running board and guided us up a mile up the road. My youngsters tried to amuse him along the way. Will wiggled his ears, and Jill crossed her eyes, and Chester twitched his nose like a rabbit. But I reckon Mr. Jones wasn't used to youngsters. Hester flapped her arms like a bird, Peter whistled through his front teeth, which were missing, and Tom tried to stand on his head in the back of the car. Mr. Heck Jones ignored them all. Finally, he raised his long arm and pointed. "There's your property, neighbor," he said. Didn't we tumble out of the car in a hurry? We gazed with delight at our new farm. It was broad and sunny, with an oak tree on a gentle hill. There was one defect, to be sure. A boggy-looking pond spread across an acre beside the road. You could lose a cow in a place like that. But we had got a bargain, no doubt about it. "Mama," I said to my dear Melissa, "see that fine old oak on the hill? That's where we'll build our farmhouse." "No, you won't," said Mr. Heck Jones. "That oak ain't on your property." "But, sir, all that's yours is what you see underwater, not a rock or a tree or stump in it, like I said." I thought he must be having his little joke, except that there wasn't a smile to be found on his face. "But, sir," I said, "you clearly stated that the farm was 80 acres. "That's right." "That marshy pond hardly covers an acre." "That's wrong," he said. "There are a full 80 acres, one piled on the other like griddle cakes. I didn't say your farm was all on the surface. It's 80 acres deep, McBroom. Read the deed." I read the deed. It was true. "Hee-haw, hee-haw," he snorted. "I got the best of you, McBroom. Good day, neighbor." He scurried away, laughing up his sleeve all the way home. I soon learned that Mr. Heck was always laughing up his sleeve. Folks told me that when he'd hang up his coat and go to bed, all that stored-up laughter would pour out his sleeve and keep him awake nights. But there's no truth to that. I'll tell you about the watermelons in a minute. Well, there we stood gazing at our 1-acre farm that wasn't good for anything but jumping into on a hot day. And the day was the hottest I could remember. The hottest on record, as it turned out. That was the day, 3 minutes before noon, when the cornfields all over Iowa exploded into popcorn. That's history. You must have read about that. There are pictures to prove it. I turned to my children. Will, Jill, Hester, Chester, Peter, Polly, Tim, Tom, Mary, Larry, and little Clorinda, I said. There's always a bright side to things. That pond we bought off is a mite muddy, but it's wet. Let's jump in and cool off. That idea met with favor, and we were soon in our swimming togs. I gave the signal, and we took a running jump. At that moment, such a dry spell struck that we landed in an acre of dry earth. The pond had evaporated. It was very surprising. My boys had jumped in head first, and there was nothing to be seen of them but their legs kicking in the air. I had to pluck them out of the earth like carrots. Some of my girls were still holding their noses. Of course, they were sorely disappointed to have that swimming hole pulled out from under them. But the moment I ran the topsoil through my fingers, my farmer's heart skipped a beat. That pond bottom felt as soft and rich as black silk. My dear Melissa, I called, come look. This topsoil is so rich it ought to be kept in a bank. I was in a sudden fever of excitement. That glorious topsoil seemed to cry out for seed. My dear Melissa had a sack of dried beans along, and I sent Will and Chester to fetch it. I saw no need to bother plowing the field. I directed Polly to draw a straight furrow with a stick, and Tim to follow her, poking holes in the ground. Then I came along. I dropped a bean in each hole and stamped it on it with my heel. Well, I had hardly gone a couple yards when something green and leafy tangled my foot. I looked behind me. There was a beanstalk traveling along in a hurry and looking for a pole to climb on. Glory be, I exclaimed. That soil was rich. The stalks were spreading out all over. I had to rush along to keep ahead of them. By the time I got to the end of the furrow, the first stalks had blossomed and the pods had formed, and they were ready for picking. You can imagine our excitement. Will's ears wiggled, Jill's eyes crossed, Chester's nose twitched, Hester's arms flapped, Peter's missing front teeth whistled, and Tom stood on his head. Will, Jill, Hester, Chester, Peter, Polly, Tim, Tom, Mary, Larry, and little Clorinda, I shouted, harvest them beans! Within an hour we had planted and harvested that entire crop of beans, but it was hot working in the sun. I sent Larry to find a good acorn along the road. We planted it, but it didn't grow near as fast as I had expected. We had to wait an entire 3 hours for a shade tree. We made camp under our oak tree, and the next day we drove to Barnesville with our crop of beans. I traded it for various seeds, carrot and beet and cabbage and other items. The storekeeper found a few kernels of corn that hadn't popped at the very bottom of the bin. But we found out that corn was positively dangerous to plant. The stalk shot up so fast it would skin your nose. Of course, there was a secret to that topsoil. A government man came out and made a study of the matter. He said there had once been a huge lake in that part of Iowa. It had taken thousands of years to shrink up to our pond, as you can imagine. The lake fish must have got packed in worse than sardines. There's nothing like fish to put nitrogen in the soil. That's a scientific fact. Nitrogen makes things grow to be all, and we did occasionally turn up a fishbone. It wasn't long before Mr. Heck Jones came around to pay us a neighborly call. He was eating a raw turnip. When he saw the way we were planting and harvesting cabbage, his eyes popped out of his head. It almost cost him his eyesight. He scurried away, muttering to himself. My dear Melissa, I said, that man is up to mischief. Folks in town had told me that Mr. Heck Jones had the worst farmland in Iowa. He couldn't give it away. Tornado winds had carried off his topsoil and left the hard pan right on top. He had to plow it with wedges and a sledgehammer. One day we heard a lot of booming on the other side of the hill, and my youngsters went up to see what was happening. It turned out he was planting seeds with a shotgun. Meanwhile, we went about our business on the farm. I don't mind saying that before long we were showing a handsome profit. Back in Connecticut, we had been lucky to harvest one crop a year. Now we were planting and harvesting 3 or 4 crops a day. But there were things we had to be careful about. Weeds, for one thing. My youngsters took turns standing weed guard. The instant a weed popped out of the ground, they'd race to it and hoe it to death. You can imagine what would happen if weeds ever got going in rich soil like ours. We also had to be careful about planting time. Once we planted lettuce just before my dear Melissa rang the noon bell for dinner. While we ate, the lettuce headed up and went to seed. We lost the whole crop. One day back came Mr. Hike Jones with a grin on his face. He had figured out a loophole in the deed that made the farm ours. Hee-haw, he laughed. He was munching a radish. I got the best of you now, neighbor McBroom. The deed says you were to pay me everything in your purse, and you didn't. On the contrary, sir, I answered, $10. There wasn't another cent in my purse. There were moths in the purse. I seen 'em flutter out. 3 milky white moths, McBroom. I want 3 moths by 3 o'clock this afternoon, or I am to take back the farm. Hee-haw. And off he went, laughing up his sleeve.